right, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this morning's Ohio Rock Talks during Earth Science Week. Today, we're going to talk about geoscience and the workforce, and it's kind of an inclusive area. We're going to talk about how accessible and innovative it is. First of all, I'm Stephanie O'Grady. We've got Chuck Sammons with us, who's going to help with the Q&A, and you can throw those in the box, and we'll try to bring them up as they come, and we'll also save some time for questions at the end. We also posted some videos that have to do with today's talk in there if you want to check that out. And then today we're going to talk to some people from the University of Cincinnati, Dr. Chris Atchison. He's the Associate Professor of Geoscience Education and the Executive Director of the International Association for Geoscience Diversity. He's joined by Ian Castro, Geoscience Education PhD student at UC, and he'll be starting a 2-year term as the executive counselor for the IAGD later this month. So let's go ahead and we'll get started. Chris, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can go on.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. Give me 1 second to get started here. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We want to talk about some things that we've been working on here at UC, as well as kind of around the world through the IAGD, and we'll explain pretty much what the IAGD is and where it came from here briefly. But we want to talk about how we teach the earth sciences, how we engage with the earth, and how traditionally that's been very exclusive for people who have disabilities. There's been a lot of students come through that are interested in pursuing the geosciences as a career, and oftentimes they're discouraged from doing so because of the rigorous field expectations that the undergraduate curriculum requires. And so my research at UC, as well as Ian's research, is looking at the accessibility and the inclusivity that can be done just by changing the way that we teach the earth, and how that has an impact, or how that can have an impact on the future of the geoscience workforce. So we're looking at this from the accessible, the inclusive, and the innovative by bringing diverse perspectives to the table. So as we get started, I want, if you think about what a geoscientist is, or in fact, if you go to Google and you just do a search for geoscientist, a lot of times these are the images that are going to be brought up. And as you might imagine, these aren't images that someone who might be a wheelchair user would want to see if they are interested in pursuing the earth sciences as a discipline or as a career possibility. This might not be something they can connect with. And interestingly enough, a lot of our earth science departments around the country and around the world like to portray these types of adventurous images to draw in a certain type of a student, when we all realize that this isn't the only thing that an earth scientist does. So we're perpetuating this idea that in order to be a geoscientist, you have to be physically able to do it. And that's simply not the case. So a lot of times when our students go through the undergraduate programs, a lot of times the work that they do in the field, studying in the field requirements, it's often just as much of a rite of passage than it is a meaningful learning experience. We're starting to get into the idea that the field, although it is a very big requirement and it is a great experience, don't get me wrong, there are a lot of other sub-disciplines within the geosciences that we need to be promoting just as much as the field learning. So this was a quote that came out of one of our colleagues, Alison Stokes, over at the University of Plymouth in the UK. We need to think beyond the boundaries of our own beliefs and experiences. So the way that we were taught doesn't necessarily mean that's the way that we need to be teaching our current students and our future students. The way that we do things in the workforce doesn't need to be the way that, or the way that we've been taught to do things in the workforce shouldn't be the way that we continue to do things if those are perpetuating boundaries or barriers to other people from participating. So I want us to realize that diversity is not the issue that we're dealing with here. You know, there's a lot of things going on in STEM across the country right now, in fact, talking about how we need to promote broadening diversity. Well, I'm here to say that diversity isn't the issue, especially when it comes to the disabilities. One out of every 5 Americans has a disability, according to the US Census. So when we talk about diversity, we often hear about race, gender, ethnicity, right, sexual orientation, and so on. But understanding that all of those aspects of diversity can have disability as well. So it's something that we call an intersectionality. So every piece of diversity can have disability. Disability is the largest, the majority diversity, if you will. 1 out of every 3 American households have at least one member who have a disability of some kind. And around the world, it represents 15%. People with disabilities represent 15% of the world's population. So again, I go back and say diversity isn't the issue. What is the issue, or what are the issues? It's a lack of access. It's a lack of equity. It's a lack of inclusion, of social justice. And most of all, in the sense, in the way that we present this presentation today, it's a lack of opportunity for people with disabilities to participate in a discipline that is traditionally physically rigorous. So if we think about disability, you know, we all fall on a continuum of ability, right? We all see, hear, learn, walk differently. We read, print, we can write with a pen or a pencil, we can communicate verbally, socialize, tune out distraction, manage our physical and our mental health, which during a global pandemic is a little bit more of a challenge. But we all fall on this continuum. So understanding that disability, it's a natural condition, it's a natural human condition. So I want you all to consider your own daily communication and classroom and workplace activities. Just take a minute and think about what are the challenges and barriers that could keep someone from actively participating, either in your classroom or your workplace. Think about your home. How is your home set up? Is it accessible to everyone? But more so than just disability, think about the cultural inclusion, the emotional inclusion, intellectual, physical, the sensory inclusion, social inclusion. Is your workplace or your classroom socially inclusive? These are all things that we work to address through the research of accessibility and inclusion in the geosciences. So last year, actually, I think this was 2 years ago, Robin Bell, who's the current president, which I need to change president-elect to president, of the American Geophysical Union. Dr. Bell states that the success and advancement of Earth and space sciences depends on a diverse pool of researchers, more than just researchers, right? A diverse pool of students, of talent, of people who are interested in pursuing this. We do better science when diverse voices are at the table. So why is this important? Why is diversity important for us? Well, a lot of our Fortune 500 and Fortune 100 companies have already figured this out. Diversity is vital for innovation. Diversity boosts innovation, right? So a lot of our companies are finding that if we continue to do things the way we've always done them, we are going to become stagnant. in our sciences and our industries and anything you can imagine. We need to bring in people with diverse perspectives who see the world differently than the rest of the community that we're bringing them into. That's why it's important to open up the accessibility in neurosciences. Here's a really great image. It's a little bit blurry, I apologize, but you can go to the link below. The Americangeosciences Institute put together this really great graphic that shows that anyone that goes into the earth sciences to study as an undergraduate major have ended up in all kinds of separate industries, from nonprofit organizations, academia, government, industry, and research. So thinking about what a geoscientist does, you need to be thinking about everything that falls on this graphic. It's not just someone who goes out in the field with a hammer and breaks up rocks all day to study them. It's a lot more than that. So I'm going to turn it over to Ian here to talk about universal design as the way that we introduce the instruction.
Thank you very much, Chris. So for universal design of learning, which I'll be calling UDL for majority of this presentation, essentially, if you're an instructor, you might be familiar with this framework, but for those of you who aren't, the goal of UDL is this framework for improving teaching and learning for all students. So this focuses on teaching through multiple methods of engagement, representation, and action and expression. So engagement serves as, the why of the learning. Representation reflects the what of the learning. So what are the students going to be learning? And action and expression is the how of the learning. And by that, I mean, what are the opportunities for the students to demonstrate their understanding? So how can we understand that they know the material? So to ensure this, you're fine, you can keep going. We look at, to ensure all learners have access, we look at these three pillars, as I said. We have engagement, representation, action, and expression. You'll notice on this diagram, it breaks each of these down into columns, and it talks about how we can encourage access, how we can help students build knowledge, and how can we help them internalize this said knowledge. And it shows the three main goals that come out of this. So we're trying to create expert learners, and we define expert learners as students who are purposeful and motivated, resourceful and knowledgeable, and also strategic and goal-directed. Next slide, please.
And so I want to jump in here real quick, Ian, and say that this graphic is from cast.org, cast.org, C-A-S-T. And it's a really great resource. If you're not familiar with Universal Design for Learning, it's a really great resource to go check out. They've got a lot of things that you can integrate into your instruction.
So I wanted to take some time to explain some examples of how UDL can be applied. So Chris and I teach this course called Introduction to Geoscience Education. What I've done here is I've presented some examples from the chart that you just saw, and I wanted to go into these in a little more detail. So to summarize what we're going to talk about, some of the tenets of UDL are presenting information through multiple forms. So this can be through video, demonstrations, written directions, and other such materials. We also talk about clarifying vocabulary and symbols. We often see this with science terminology or jargon. We also try to highlight patterns and relationships. So I'll explain how we do that in our classroom through a framework called the Earth System. Developing self-assessment and reflection. So I'll give an example of some of the weekly reflection assignments that our students do. Optimizing relevance. So we're trying to engage with the students in this course. In particular, we're dealing with young education students. So trying to connect them to the geoscience material. And lastly is multiple means of communication. So this is audio, video, text-based communication with students. So the first one I want to talk about is teaching through multiple forms of representation. The first image you see here is the stereotypical way that we teach In the sciences, it's often a term such as, here I'm talking about a plate boundary, normally with a diagram or image. However, UDL pushes us to go a little beyond that. So I have another example here that along with this, I've also incorporated a video that shows animations, adds additional information and context. So they're getting another form of internalizing this content. And then to go even further, we have here a Google Earth image of the same type of plate boundary. This is the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. And what we're doing here is we're able to show them the context in real time. So we're able to show them the earth science conceptually, we're able to see it in action through the animation, and then we're able to see the real world context. And all of this relates back to the concept being presented. So the students are able to engage through this material in multiple forms. And the next one is clarifying vocabulary and symbols. So there's two ways we can do this. The first example I want to deal with is when we're trying to present information without the need for the students to have prior knowledge. So here I've taken a common vocabulary term called subduction, and instead of just showing the term and defining it, what we're trying to do here is contextualize the jargon. So instead of focusing on subduction is this, instead of going, what is actually happening in this process? We can point it out on a diagram, explain it in more detail, and then students are able to connect that to what the term actually means. The other way of doing that is you can almost do the opposite. So you can introduce the content before the terminology and allow the students to describe what is going on in their own words. So I could have started with a very similar diagram as the one here and ask the students to think about what is happening here and have them apply their own knowledge and their own observations to describe this event. And then from their own description, we can then provide them the terminology. So this thing that you've just described in your own way, this refers to a process called subduction. So here we're seeing multiple ways that students can connect with this material and understand complex terminology that's often present in the sciences. The next one is highlighting patterns and relationships. I mentioned that in this course we use a framework known as the Earth system. Essentially what this entails is you have these 5 components that all interact together. So we have the lithosphere, which is essentially all of the geoscience processes. You have the biosphere, which is living organisms, the atmosphere, which deals with climate, the hydrosphere, which is water, the cryosphere, which is ice. Whenever we introduce new material or new concepts, we always come back to the question of how does this impact the Earth system? Or how is this involved with the Earth system? How might this aspect interact with another part of the Earth system? So the students have this almost as an anchor. They can always view this material from this lens and use that to connect the newer material to what they've already learned. So not only does this encourage the students to retain the knowledge that they're given early on, but it also allows them to always connect back to something with newer material. The next one is when we develop self-assessment and reflection. So we try to provide prompts for students to reflect on course material. The importance of this is we're allowing the students to not only tie in knowledge from the course, but they're also connecting to their own educational interests. So here I have an example of a prompt for our geoscience educators. We had just covered the theory of plate tectonics and how it was developed. In this reflection statement, we pose an ethical question to our students where this theory was introduced in the 1960s. And, this was very recent geoscience knowledge that changed our whole understanding of this field. So the ethical question that was provided is, would you as an educator teach this view of the earth sciences to your class, and why or why not? So this forces the students to understand the base knowledge of plate tectonics and then places them in an ethical spot as educators to go, how would you approach changes to the science that can fundamentally affect our understanding of it? how would you go about presenting that? Would you present it? Would you avoid it? Would you introduce it as with caveats? So this forces the students to reflect on their own learning and how they wish to present information in their future careers. Another important aspect is optimizing relevance. So students connect better with material if they can see how it connects not only to their daily lives, but also their future career choices. In order to facilitate this for our educator students, we've provided a project that we call the micro-teaching activity project. So essentially we allow students to pick from the Ohio Science Teaching Standards. Ideally, it's a standard focused on their age group of choice. They are forced to take this geoscience material, understand it, and then from that material they are to create an activity that is hands-on and engaging that demonstrates that standard. So they're taking the geoscience knowledge that they're being taught and they're being forced to apply it in a realistic teaching setting, which is what they are all working towards. So this not only facilitates their growth as geoscientists, but it also helps them to grow as educators. So we're seeing a direct connection with the earth sciences and these students' future careers. The next one is multiple means of communication. So when we're reaching out to students, oftentimes we tend to use learning management systems at University of Cincinnati. Particularly at UC, we use a system called Canvas. So here you'll see a screenshot of the announcements tab. So I always post on here after class, or if there are any other concerns that pop up or important assignments to try to keep students updated. Along with this, I also send students communication via email that highlights, again, these major themes, ensuring that the students are receiving this text-based communication through numerous means, even if they don't have as much access to one. And lastly here, you can see that this is a video recording of the lecture that also contains these announcements. So I'm reaching out to the students in person when they're in class. They're seeing the video recordings of the lecture, they're seeing them via email, and they're also receiving them through our learning management system. So students are receiving the same information through numerous outlets to ensure that they are informed and that they can perform the necessary tasks in the classroom.
All right, Ian, thank you. So I'm going to change gears here, and I'm going to talk about a lot of the same UDL methods, but how we apply those to the field, how we get students learning in the field through multiple means of representation, action expression, and engagement. And so I show this picture here because it's a great reason of what this looks like when you talk about accessibility. This is a picture from a field course that we taught a few years ago in Western Ireland. And so this is a really great image to show that there are multiple perspectives of both access and inclusion. You can see the two individuals here who are both looking through cameras from different perspectives, but then if you look over to the left, you'll see some rock outcrops, you'll see a creek, you'll see people down by the creek, and that area is really inaccessible to people who cannot physically get down there. And in fact, it was inaccessible to a lot of people because those were really dense bogs that you would sink into, so it was very difficult. So let's talk about the field. So here's an example, another example of a trip that we were at in British Columbia, up in Vancouver. And so you'll see down by the river, you can kind of make out that there are people down there on the bigger rocks looking closer in closer detail at the site. But there are also some of our students who physically couldn't get down there, so they had other observations that they needed to make that were different from the other folks. But what made this inclusive was that when everybody came back together is when we would have our instruction. So when you're trying to develop an inclusive community, you don't try to teach people individually. You have a conversation together where you can share the information and everybody's perspectives can be included and heard and valued. So in this instance, a lot of the students that were down by the river would bring hand samples back to share with everybody and talk about what they saw. And the people who were up above were explaining the observations that they were making from a different vantage point. So when we talk about instructional diversity in the field, we use multiple representation, much like Ian was talking about in the classroom. We design exercises for those who are unable to get to the outcrops, and we use photographs of the site. Thin sections it's a way of cutting into the rock and using microscopes to be able to view what the rocks are made of. We can use different hand samples. And we also include additional data that's unavailable to the students who are actually up at the outcrop. So we require all of our students to make observations given the information and materials available to them. And then when we bring everybody back together for those debriefing sessions, we're able to let those students talk about the observations they made and share their information with their peers. So here's an example of a student who wasn't able to get to the outcrop itself, but had images of the outcrop along with descriptions, maybe some questions to think about, and they were responsible for making observations that then they would present to their peers when we bring everybody back together. So here's another example of a site in just outside of Flagstaff, Arizona. This was a volcanic crater that we were studying, but as you might imagine, not everybody can get up to or up on top of this volcano. And so how we managed that was through the use of technology. So students who were able to get to the top were using iPads to both take video, take pictures, and then we used two-way radios to be able to communicate back down to the students who weren't able to get up there. So in real time, we were able to talk about what was being seen, collaboratively make observations and interpretations of the site. So this bottom image shows from the top of the crater an ancient lava flow from this volcano. And in real time, one of our students was receiving video from up there, and we're hearing from their colleagues about what they were seeing, and they were able to make collaborative observations. So again, back at the site we were previously talking about in Ireland, this was one of the locations. This was an old road, but there were some amazing outcrops that our students could physically get up to. So we broke the group into two. Along the creek, and there was a big lake there, we sent students to go that were physically able to get to those sites, but the other students were responsible for making observations along this road. And so when we brought everybody back together, they shared those in an inclusive community. Some of their colleagues that went down along the lake, again, were using their technology to capture the data. The student on the left was actually able to make measurements of the rock, strike and dip measurements of the rock through an app on their iPad. The student to the right was actually documenting this in video to send to their colleagues in real time what they were doing, how they were collecting data, the observations that they were making, and they were in communication with them the whole time. So these are some of on the left, the picture is an image that was being sent back of one of the outcrops. And then the picture on the right, they were all responsible for making a map of the location. And so they were sharing their images with each other, making a map, even when they were working across distance, separated. So here's one last example of an opportunity that we led in Wales, in Northwest Wales over in the UK. This is when it was the day that it was completely inaccessible for everyone because it was one of the lovely Wales downpour days. It was raining so hard that none of us got outside. So we actually utilized an online program of this site called Virtual Landscapes. I'll give you a link to that in a second, where students had to use all of these different means to make observations and to create a map of the area through these observations. So one of them was they had data that they could collect. It was a simulated environment, a virtual environment that they could go through. where they were able to go through different stops and put data on their map about the measurements they needed to take. They also had the thin sections, like I talked to you about before, where they could look at the different rock types, the lithologies, the mineralogy of the rocks that were in this location. They were able to collaborate with each other. They were able to collaborate with their instructors in real time. And so we were able to create this inclusive community with everybody present, and the physical accessibility didn't matter. We were able to all do the geology, do the learning together in a collaborative setting. And then so I want to point to a few resources available to you all. This last year, given the impact of the pandemic, obviously we don't have an opportunity to get together in person to do a lot of these activities. So myself and several colleagues back in March came together, realizing that the field season, the summer field season, was going to be in jeopardy. That a lot of universities were either postponing or canceling because there wasn't a way to get groups of students into the field. So we came together and started talking about a way of teaching field experiences through distance learning. The link provided here, the IAGD.org, teaching resources, field designing remote field experiences. That's a link to a wealth of resources, mostly focused on higher ed, but there are examples of freely available distance learning field sites that you can visit, including the one that I just showed, the virtual landscapes one out of Wales. Below that is the Teach the Earth. This is an incredible wealth of resources for anything, a K-12 mostly, two-year colleges, higher education departments, workshops. Everything on the Teach the Earth website is freely available as well. Believe me when I say that you'll get in here and you'll fall down so many rabbit holes and get lost because there are so many resources to pick from. So I encourage any of you to check out these Teach the Earth resources. And so just to kind of wrap up here, you know, what is it that we do to build an inclusive community, right? Our main goal here was to look at diversity and diverse perspectives, and it has to be accessible and inclusive. So what are the things that we do to get started? And so this can be at K-12, this could be in higher education, but we really encourage our students to communicate their specific needs to the instructors. Now, understanding in K-12, they don't really have the responsibility to do that. But once they get into higher education, the students are completely responsible for themselves and communicating their needs. So we encourage our students to start a dialogue about disability and the best ways that instructors can work with them. The instructors then are responsible for listening to the individual needs of the students. Not questioning them. If it's something that they're asking for, an accommodation that they need to listen to that and then plan and design collaboratively to best address those needs and for the students' abilities. Understanding that this communication is essential to build an accessible and inclusive learning community, ensure the best outcomes for all of our students. Understanding this too, that those of us who may not have a disability of some kind shouldn't be making decisions for students that have disabilities without including them in the decision-making process. So this is a saying that has been around for quite a long time, that there should be nothing about us without us. So no decision-making for a particular student with a disability without including their voice in that decision-making process. And so I point to a really great resource here of a paper that I co-authored with a couple of colleagues, or a few colleagues, that looks at the perspectives of autistic geoscientists and the need to work with those geoscientists or those students when you're designing something to be inclusive. So what I really loved about working with these three was they're all autistic, and they really brought a wealth of information to this paper. So if you have an opportunity to read this in the Journal of Geoscience Education, it just came out a few months ago. And understand too that full participation does not have to mean 100% physical access to every activity. So just as I showed you, there's a lot of things about being included, but not necessarily at the field site that you're talking about. And so think about ways that you can get your students involved in activities. Even in the classroom, students might not be able to do aspects of the activity, thinking of like a laboratory activity, but that doesn't mean they can't be included and involved and have a perspective to share that can be valued. And so I will finish here by talking about the IEGD and Dig UK. The IEGD is an organization that we started back in 2008 as a network, as a way to share these resources to create access and inclusion for anyone interested in pursuing the geosciences or the earth sciences, either in academia or in geoscience industry. And Dig UK is a chapter that we formed in London. Across the UK, it's actually sponsored by the Geological Society of London. And so they're doing very similar things throughout the UK that the IAGD is doing very specifically here in the US. All right, and I'll turn that over to Ian real quick.
So going back to the IAGD, I wanted to point out some resources that instructors and students can use in order to reach out for assistance with, finding resources or feedback for increasing accessibility. One of the main ones is the use of the IAGD Listserv, which is a service that students and faculty can subscribe to, that they can present issues regarding accessibility and inclusion. These can be issues that they themselves are facing. It could be issues that a student is facing that a faculty member wants to be able to help with. And what happens here is that fellow members of the IAGD will respond, and they can provide resources, feedback, recommendations, what have you. The most important part about this is not only are you getting feedback from people who are experts in inclusion and accessibility, you're getting feedback from people who have very likely gone through these exact same barriers. You're dealing with people who have been the most affected by the lack thereof regarding accessibility resources. So you're getting, though that ties back to Chris's earlier points about nothing about us without us. Instead of just making decisions or talking to a committee about ways to be more accessible, you're talking to the people who are directly affected. And then students and teachers can then engage with this network for future insight as issues continue to develop or pop up. Or, for example, we've had issues, people bring up concerns regarding the pandemic. We've had people bring concerns about physical disabilities, mental disabilities, what have you. That network is available. The second part about this is the use of accessible field trips. So students and teachers can join the IAGD on specially designed field trips like the ones that Chris showed in his images, where here you can learn about accessible field techniques and teaching practices. You can also see a lot of the methodology that we use, a lot of the thought process that we use. So when we're regarding things like flexibility, site location, what have you. So you learn not only how to run that specific field trip, but you get a lot of the principles that we apply in the IAGD to designing these kinds of field trips for any location.
Okay. And then understanding too that that these field trips and the listserv, and I will say, and I think Chuck probably put the link in the website or link to the IAGD website in the chat window. You can get to the IAGD listserv just by going to the IAGD website and the link is under the Connect. So you can get that information. And if anybody's interested in any of the accessible field trip experiences, you can also reach out to us. So last that I want to leave you with is this. When you plant lettuce and if it does not grow well, You don't blame the lettuce. You look for reasons that it's not doing well, right? So I want us to think about the same thing with respect to our students. If you put the student in a learning environment and if the student's not doing well, do you blame the student? Or do you look at reasons in the environment that the student is not doing well? If you look at the way that you're instructing them, are they not doing well? Understand that disability is not a deficit in the individual. Think back to the spectrum of ability that I presented to you earlier. Disability is a social construct that is attempting to define an environmental deficit. So think about this. Disability is a natural aspect of the human condition. It's how we integrate people with various abilities into society and how we integrate them and be inclusive. So understand that disability is not the problem. The environment is the problem. I'd like to thank all of the sponsors for all of our activities, the IEG activities and projects. Understand that all of our accessible field trips are completely funded. There's no cost to any of the participants that go on those, so that might be of interest for some of you in the future when we offer these, especially teachers and students. And I would like to thank you all for attending today. This is our contact information, and it's my phone number there. The links below are to the IAGD, and the @AccessibleGeo is our Twitter and our Instagram accounts. So please do connect with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, guys. We do have a question here from Brittany from ODNR. She first offers you a compliment. She wants to commend you for how intentional and deliberative you are about the equity and inclusion. Her question is, what can ODNR, GeoSurvey, or other divisions do to attract individuals with a disability to come work with us? How can we make sure they know they're welcome here and we want them to work with us?
Yeah, great question. I really appreciate that one. So think about the traditional expectations that are presented, the exclusive practices that we always do because those of us who are posting job ads aren't really thinking about anyone that doesn't have the same abilities that they do. So I think that we need to look at the way that our jobs are posted. We need to look at the way we conduct interviews. We need to look at our workplace practices. So are each of those aspects of the hiring process inclusive and accessible? Think about what the barriers are along the pathway for that. So by the way that you present a job ad, are you talking about the way that your workplace is accessible and inclusive, and you are open to providing accommodations for any individual with a disability? Is the interview process, are you providing multiple ways for that applicant to interview, through video, through text, through phone? Are you asking that person which method would they prefer to be interviewed? And then talk about the ways that your workplace is actually inclusive and accessible. We at the IEGD get a lot of times we have a lot of universities who send us job ads to post through our listserv. And I'm happy to do so, but I always send a response back to them before I post it. And I said, okay, before I post this, can you tell me what you are doing to ensure that someone with a disability can be effective in applying for this job and interviewing for this job and be satisfied in the workplace, without just pointing me to an equal opportunity employer statement that you might have or a policy that you might have. I want to actually see things in action. So those are all things that we work with various universities and places. So please reach out to me if you have more questions about this. I'd certainly be happy to work with you. Another thing really quickly is how you're promoting your workplace online? Are you sharing pictures that are accessible, or are they not? Think about how you're portraying your businesses.
Give everybody just a couple more minutes if you have any questions. Do either of you have anything you'd like to add before we wrap up?
No, I really appreciated that last question from Brittany. That I think that the idea of accessibility for disability and diversity is really a hot topic right now, and a lot of places are trying to figure out how best to make that happen. Understand that we're all sitting here completely welcoming of the idea that someone with a disability can participate, right? So the earth sciences in general is welcoming to the idea. But the problem is we expect the individual to assimilate to the way that we already do things. Like, yes, you can come. We want you here. We want you to participate. But here are the way that we do things. So we want you to assimilate to the way that we do things. We want you to change, and we want you to be a part of this. Rather than us say, yes, we want you here. We're willing to change the way we do things to make sure that you're successful. So I think that we need to look at the way that we've always done things and realize that's why people with disabilities are not coming, because of the traditional way we've always done things, and those traditional things need to change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, Chris is completely right on that regard. Essentially, adding on to that, a big aspect of this is putting the students' needs first. So having that conversation, it's not about, I need you to do these specific things, or that I think this would help you succeed, but instead of what can we do from our position to help you succeed? What resources do you need? What contacts do you need? And I'll work specifically with that individual, because everyone with disabilities has different needs. This is even more so when you're dealing with neurotypical with non-neurotypical students. So you can't treat every student who has autism spectrum disorder exactly the same. You have to really take an individualist approach here. So there's not general guidelines here. You really need to take the word of the individual that's affected.
All right, Chuck, do you see anything else that I'm missing? Because I think we are pretty good.
No, but I did want to just recognize the especially the portion of the talk where you guys discussed the approaches to the educational efforts and reaching students from all backgrounds. And I think that's, at least for me personally, as someone who is involved with the GeoSurveys efforts on the educational side of what we do, I've found that to be extremely helpful. And I just also wanted to put in, if I may, a quick plug for our geological walk through time exhibit, which is completely free and it's 100% accessible. And we've actually had, a number of educational groups who bring their students who have various disabilities to the GeoWalk to learn about geology in Ohio. And it's a great resource, and I think it's a good example of a way to offer this experience to kids and adults of all backgrounds. And so I put that in the chat. There's a link to that on our website. And we are continuing to try to do more of that. In a typical year, we would lead a number of various workshops and go into classrooms and talk to students. Unfortunately, we aren't able to do that now, but it is something that we do put a lot of thought into, and we'll continue to do so. And I really appreciate all the information that you brought to the viewers today. I just think it's wonderful.
Thank you, Chuck.
Thank you.
Yeah, you guys got a lot of compliments here in the Q&A too. I won't read them out loud, but you can check them out. I thought that was really, really good. For anybody listening or watching, there are a lot of resources posted in the Q&A for the topics discussed today. And we'll welcome you guys to join us again tomorrow at 10 o'clock for another Rock Talk, which is on the everyday use for geological maps. So that's at 10 o'clock tomorrow. But otherwise, thanks for tuning in. Thank you, Dr. Atchison, Ian, for your presentation. Hopefully we'll see you all tomorrow.